Hello, everybody. Welcome to Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States. And today, our topic will be something that we talk about a lot on the Pod TV network, even have its own show called Ukraine, Russia, and China. It's Ukraine. In other words, the economics of Ukraine, the war that's been going on now for 3 years. So with that, we're going to bring in some people that know a little bit or a lot about it. First of all, the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States. I'm pretty sure this has been a problem that you guys have had in Washington, D.C., is what to do with Ukraine and also the amount of money that we've been spending on Ukraine. So give us what your thoughts are, and then we have some special guests from around the world who are going to be joining us.
Well, let me give an introduction and go back to some things that I've said in prior programs. As of this very moment, President Trump is on the phone with President Putin from Russia, talking about the Ukraine-Russia situation. And after the president gets done speaking with Putin, he's going to be talking with Zelensky, chief of state for Ukraine. And I know that Trump is very dedicated to try to get a ceasefire and ultimately a settlement of this conflict. But let me, if I can, go back in time and remind you some things that I've said previously. In December of 2021, my wife and I were scheduled to go on a Black Sea cruise that would go to a number of different countries, including Ukraine and Russia. But I had a bad feeling, that Russia was going to go into Ukraine right after the Olympics, which were being held in China that year. And so as a result, in December of 2021, I canceled our Black Sea cruise because of that belief that Russia was going to go into Ukraine. And I believe that that was precipitated in large part because of how badly the United States exited Afghanistan in August of that year. And in addition to that, the fact that when Russia invaded and took over Crimea in 2014, when Obama was president and Biden was vice president, they did nothing. Nothing was done. And so I think those two things caused Putin to invade Ukraine. My personal view is when he invaded Ukraine, he wanted to accomplish several objectives. Number one, he wanted to take over eastern Ukraine, which has a number of minerals and facilities that he deemed to be valuable, and has a number of, provinces that where there are a fair number of Russian speakers, if you will, and to also provide a bridge to Crimea, a land bridge to Crimea. Secondly, he wanted to topple the government in Kyiv and put in a friendly government similar to what has happened in Belarus. But he didn't want to take over the entire country of Ukraine. He wanted to take over eastern Ukraine for the reasons that I articulated, topple the government in western Ukraine, and leave a buffer between Russia and NATO. In my opinion, and again, this is my opinion, he had no desire whatever to take on NATO. And frankly, given how his army and military in general has performed against the heroic measures of Ukraine, his military capabilities have been degraded. Frankly, it's been an embarrassing conflict for them because they have a lot more material, they have a lot more manpower, and yet the Ukrainians have behaved in a heroic manner. But here's where we are today. Where we are today is a stalemate. There's a stalemate on the battlefield, very similar to what happened in 1953 on the Korean continent. We'll have to see what ends up happening. It doesn't look like either one of the countries can score a significant victory. And so the real question is how is this thing going to end? First, you need to have a ceasefire, and then you need to have negotiations as to how it's going to end. And I've said all along, I think in large part, it's probably going to end very similar, whether we like it or not, to how the Korean War ended. And that is an agreement to stop fighting an agreement that people will stay where they are. But I think in addition to that, I think Ukraine rightfully wants to join the European Union. Ukraine rightfully wants meaningful security guarantees. I think it'll be short of joining NATO. I don't think that will happen, but I think they need to get meaningful security guarantees and potentially peacekeeping troops that would be deployed in the country, not U.S., because the U.S. doesn't provide peacekeeping troops, including the UN, although it does provide significant funding for peacekeeping operations around the world. Other countries provide the troops. So we'll see how this thing is going to end. I just hope it ends sooner rather than later. Oh, by the way, one of the latest items is the minerals deal, the rare earth minerals deal that's been done between the United States and Ukraine. And I hear things like, well, Ukraine has the second most rare earth minerals of any European country. And that may be true. But what they don't tell you is that they don't have a lot, that a vast majority of rare earth minerals are in Asia, in particular in China and in Vietnam. They have an overwhelming majority of rare earth minerals. And China has an even larger majority of processing capacity with regard to rare earth minerals. So the first thing they don't tell you is there's not a lot of them there. Okay. The second thing they don't tell you is they're in Russian occupied territory, largely. Okay. And so, I frankly get tired of hearing, people in the media and people in government saying things that are technically accurate, but grossly misleading because they don't provide you contextual sophistication. So we'll see what happens today with regard to the discussions between President Trump and President Putin, and between President Trump and President Zelensky. I'm hoping that we can end up having this conflict in before too long. President Trump has overstated, the deaths that are occurring every week. He says 5,000 a week. It's several thousand, and that's tragic in and of itself. Plus, you have people wounded. And then on the eastern part of Ukraine, it's been totally devastated. I mean, it looks much like Berlin and certain other countries looked at the end of World War II. I mean, just total devastation. And so there's a tremendous amount that's going to have to be done to be able to rebuild those areas when the conflict finally does end. So that's enough to start, I think. And I'm particularly interested in hearing, what Sasha has to say, since Sasha was born in Ukraine and obviously is very interested in this. And I think actually hosts a pod TV show on this that runs, I believe, weekly, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we do. We have a show that runs twice a week, and we have two of the panelists that are on that show that will be speaking about Ukraine. One, everyone knows here, is Sasha Starr, was actually born in Odessa, so he's very familiar with Ukraine. The other one is he's basically Professor John Lockwood, who actually has been on the show quite some time.
Since about August 2022.
Since August of 2022. So he's been continuously looking at the war in Ukraine. So they give us some commentary from the show, which is Ukraine, Russia, and China. What's happened? All I saw was they had a meeting. 2 hours later, everything's gone and nothing happened. So, I guess we'll start with Dr. John Lockwood. Dr. John, what is your thoughts? What's going on in Ukraine right now, this Ukraine war?
Well, right now, Russia is about to reach what Clausewitz used to call the culminating point of its offensive. Clausewitz spoke of in virtually any war, the attacker eventually reaches a point where he is no longer capable of sustaining offensive action, and it opens up an opportunity for the defender to counterattack and reverse all those gains that the attacker made. In this case, Russia has the correlation of forces that the Russians used to like to speak of when they were the Soviets, has been steadily shifting against the Russians in this war. The Institute for the Study of War and some others have noted that the The Russians started out with the war with a 15-1 superiority in artillery. That is now down to 2-1 superiority in artillery. I must also point out that logistics has never been a strong point of either the Soviet army or the Russian army. Matter of fact, David probably is aware of that, and others are aware that during World War II, the Russian logistics system was largely horse-drawn wagons, and were it not for the fact that the United States during World War II supplied Russia through Lend-Lease with Ford trucks, the Red Army would never have had the logistical capabilities to support the offensives that eventually drove Nazi Germany out of the Soviet Union. But they have never corrected the inherent corruption and flaws in their logistics system. Sasha has noted on his program, he has noted that that right now the Russian army is using donkeys, and there is donkeys, golf carts, all sorts of makeshift stuff in an effort to try and resupply their offensives, and it's why their offensives are not making any real progress. They have run out of steam. They have reached, arguably, the culminating point of their offensive efforts. And what Sasha and I and Ivan have been discussing is that at some point in the near to intermediate future, we believe, or certainly I believe, that Ukraine is waiting for the proper time and place to conduct a decisive counteroffensive to regain the true center of gravity of this conflict, which is the Crimea. They will be able to cut off the Crimea from logistical reinforcement and resupply, and thus isolating the Russian occupiers of Crimea. And then they will use whatever strategic reserve they have managed to form, and we cannot bet against the possibility that they have formed a strategic reserve for this purpose, and that they will use that reserve to attack the Russian occupiers of Crimea and retake the Crimea, which would be a decisive operational blow against the Russian army, one that they could not explain away or disguise, and that would form a firmer foundation for establishing at least an armistice and winning a peace that way. Also, to Dave Walker's point about the European Union, the European Union has stated that its sanctions against Russia will not be removed until Russia withdraws from all of Ukraine. That's their red line. Until they completely withdraw from Ukraine, no removal of sanctions. And they're counting on the United States to join in and basically channel President Trump's frustration with the Russians. He may well join in and apply sanctions as well to further increase the pressure. When you take all of those factors and you consider them together as one unified whole, as Dave recommends, then it becomes apparent that the Russians are in what Sasha would call Zugzwang, forced move. No good moves left for the Russians. So therefore, the best they could do at this point is declare victory and go home.
Okay, we'll listen to what Sasha has to say. Give us an update on Ukraine.
David, in your presentation, you explained very logically what Russians wanted to achieve in Ukraine. It's a land corridor from Russia to Crimea and displacing the Zelensky's government. Now, with all due respect, they're all highly offensive, militaristic, and evasive procedures, if you want to call it. I would call it, it's very similar what Hitler wanted to achieve in Poland. He needed a corridor, a land corridor to Danzig. And when he couldn't achieve it, he started Second World War. So Russia, in order to achieve what you justify as a very logical and maybe even somewhat modest goals, but that requires starting the full-scale invasion, aggressive war. So after listening to you, I still cannot justify in any point of what Russians just did in 2022. On the other hand, Ukraine was heroically fighting the invading Russian hordes. And then, with the help from United States, Europeans, it's actually started slowly to get an upper hand. And even now, while Russians are doing all these meat attacks when they're sacrificing a tenth of men every 10, 15 minutes. Basically, their attacks are they're now using motorcycles and mopeds and bicycles because they don't have enough donkeys. I'm surprised why nobody is supplying Russians more donkeys. They love them, they're very good animals, but nobody's supplying, so they run out of donkeys probably. So they're using motorcycles, mopeds, bicycles, mostly bicycles. So
all of which reflects their logistical weakness and inability to sustain them on the offensive.
Absolutely. So, so they're going, say, 3, 4 bicycles or motorcycles. They're going one after another, and Ukrainians are laughing. They see, with the drones, they see all this, and they're discussing. Sometimes you can even hear on the live broadcast. They're discussing who is taking first, who is taking last, and they're fighting. I want to take this one. No. I want to take this one. You take that one. They're discussing. So finally, attack. All 4 of them are being completely destroyed at the same time. So just in case, that's how they're losing hundreds of people every hour. In a day, they're losing 1,500 people on average lately. So how this delegation of Russians headed by Medinsky, who is supposedly a professional historian, they had a nerve to ask that Ukraine will secede the parts of this region that Russia wants to take over, even when the Russian troops haven't even been there. Zaporozhye, they've never been there, but they want Ukrainians to remove their forces from Zaporozhye so they can take it, actually. And then they want international recognition of Crimea and these 4 regions. And if Ukrainians will not agree to that, then they will take 2 more oblasts, which is regions, which is Sumskaya and Kharkiv region. And I guess if Ukrainians will still not agree, then they will take not 2, but 4 more regions. So now you tell me that they don't need Ukrainian territory. They don't want to take all Ukraine. Well, maybe they do. They just can't. Why don't you call a spade a spade? Okay?
Yeah, let me jump in. First,
Okay.
let me state at the outset, Russia is clearly the aggressor here. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It isn't the first time that they've been an aggressor. They were an aggressor with regard to Crimea in 2014. They've been aggressor with regard to other former Soviet republics.
Georgia in
exactly right. In Chechnya, absolutely correct. Okay. I'm no illusion with regard to Russia's desire to reestablish large parts of the former empire. However, there is one big difference between what happened in World War II. And as you recall, at the beginning of World War II, Germany and Russia, the Soviet Union, were working in tandem at the beginning of World War II. The big difference between today and World War II is something called nuclear weapons. Okay, that is the big difference between today and World War II. And I've always been concerned that while I don't believe that there's going to be a strategic exchange of weapons, because in the case of Ukraine, they don't have any. And again, part of that is because of the failed Budapest Agreement. And hopefully Ukraine has learned a lesson that if it's not a treaty, it really isn't worth very much. Okay. Because agreements like that are only as good as the presidential administration who signed the agreement. They're not good beyond that. At a minimum, you need a treaty, and NATO is a treaty, okay, if you will. So, one president can't back out of NATO. It's a treaty, if you will. I've always been concerned that if Russia thought that it was going to lose on the battlefield or suffer an embarrassing situation, that they might use tactical nuclear weapons. I remain concerned about that. Okay.
I share your concern to this extent, because here's the historical precedent that applies to what you're saying. During the Cold War, I noted that there would always be periodic discussions by the Soviets concerning what they considered to be the crisis of capitalism, the potential crisis of capitalism. In this, they contended that they contended that this is why they had to have a nuclear war-fighting, war survival, war-winning doctrine. Their justification was that as the socialist revolution continued to gain successes throughout the world, eventually the leaders of the capitalist bloc, in this case the United States, would become so desperate that they would unleash a nuclear war in a desperate attempt to reverse the situation. This is, I discovered in my analysis, that the Russians were in fact projecting or mirror imaging their own mindset onto their opponents. They assumed that we saw the situation exactly the same way they did, and that they would react. And they were surprised when we weren't reacting in the way they thought we would. So here you have here in the post-Cold War period, that mindset, I contend, still prevails in the minds of in the minds of the Russian leadership. They are thinking that, in this case, they are going to become so desperate to gain victory in Ukraine. Once they realize that it is not feasible, they may, in fact, and Putin vaguely alluded to this. When he said that he hoped that he did not have to use nuclear weapons. So that goes right to your point. The concern is that they may feel compelled to, as a last desperate measure, to unleash tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine in a desperate attempt to force the situation, create a strategic breakthrough in the eastern part of Ukraine, and force Ukraine's surrender. And they have also, you'll notice, have been brandishing their nuclear arsenal. All throughout this conflict, they have been playing on what they consider to be the Western fear of escalation to nuclear warfare. And so they are counting on that. That is why they see the value of nuclear weapons as their means of political leverage. It gives them cover to conduct their own offensive operations in support of their foreign policy goals, which their foreign policy concept is bezopasnost, without danger. In order for Russia to feel secure, its opponents and neighbors must be made to feel insecure or subordinate. And so that is so I share your concern that, yes, we may force Russia to its culminating point, and at that culminating point, they may have to make a decision, kind of like the Japanese had to make in World War II. In World War II, just before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy had said, okay, the Japanese could attack Pearl Harbor, but it'd be strategic suicide for them to do it. What they failed to reckon with was that the Japanese leadership was desperate when the U.S. cut off its oil and steel supplies. So yes, there is you cannot reckon without the element of desperation, and that's because we tend to view other nations as rational actors. They aren't.
Well, if I can, 1 second, if I can, again, there's a fundamental difference between strategic nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons.
Both would ruin your day.
I hope that neither one would ever be used. Okay. But as you know, with strategic nuclear weapons, you have something called MAD, mutually assured destruction. With tactical nuclear weapons, you don't. Let me come back to something that both of you said, okay? Both of you said that the former Soviet Union and now Russia has never been good with logistics. And I can tell you, I can tell you having, even though not serving in the military, having a lot of experience with regard to the Defense Department and security issues. Many generals and admirals believe that logistics are the difference between winning and losing. if you will, in a conflict.
And they have a good point.
And they have a very good point. But my point is, there's a difference between maintaining offensive operations and displacing them from where they are. One of the challenges that I see right now is, yes, you are correct, I think, that they're having real difficulty in being able to maintain offensive operations. But that's very different than displacing them from where they are. Because to a certain extent, we can see that things are starting to look more like World War I rather than World War II, which ended in a stalemate. They're starting to look more like the Korean conflict, okay, which ended in a stalemate.
Right.
And so, you know, that's my concern. That may be where we're headed. And I sure don't want Russia to use tactical nuclear weapons, because that could cause things to go the other way very, very quickly.
Oh, yeah.
About 2 years ago, Putin was warned by then President Biden and his team that if he will even try to use tactical nuclear weapon, he himself will become the target number one. And all the Russian forces, which will be at that time on the Ukrainian territory, will be, let's put it nicely, evicted from there or destroyed, if you will. Speaking about that nuclear threat, let me tell you something, that this is hanging over the world, including Western world, for the last 80 years. And here you have Ukraine, which is not even nuclear power, which is not a large economy or anything. Single-handedly, with a little help from their friends, they can actually humiliate, actually defeat Russians on a battlefield and get rid of this Russian nuclear threat for generations. So instead of hanging, because if it's a real threat and you're so much concerned about it, what if Russians will say, okay, Ukraine has to immediately capitulate, we'll give you 45 minutes. And if not, we're going to use tactical nuclear weapons. They are ready to go, and we have 6 rockets which are located here and here, there and there. You can send your representatives or see it from the satellite. They're all ready to go. And then what is West going to do? Say to Ukraine, well, listen, they're going to use nuclear, well, let's give up. Well, if that's a way to go, then he will say, I need all Ukraine, same 45, okay, I'll give you 50 minutes to reply, to think about it. Then the next one will be Alaska, then next one will be Brooklyn, base Brighton Beach, and so on. Where are you going to stop? Where are you going to stop and say, wait, how do we deal with that?
All right. Now, I want to go to Rick, but before I do, let me just say something real quick, okay? Look, reasonable people can differ, all right? And we do differ on some things. First, I don't think that Putin cared what Biden had to say. Biden is incredibly weak. I feel sorry. I pray for President Biden. Because he was diagnosed on Friday with a very serious case of cancer that has started to advance, prostate cancer. I hope and pray that he can get past this and live a long life. But he was an incredibly weak president from a security standpoint. And Ukraine is just one example. So what Biden says, quite frankly, most people don't take very seriously. Plus, he's not the president anymore. My personal view is there's no way that Russia is going to try to take on NATO because they can't even beat Ukraine. And Ukraine is not a nuclear power. NATO is. That would be the definition of insanity. And while I think the guy's got serious mental problems, I don't think he's insane. Rick?
So, can we talk about Trump's proposed Golden Dome nuclear missile defense system? Now, a couple of background things. It might cost $500 billion over the next 10 years. The physics is iffy. We tried this under Reagan with Star Wars, where the physics didn't work. The Soviet Union didn't realize this, and they bankrupted themselves, as far as I know, trying to figure out, and it collapsed the Soviet Union. But the physics is still hard to do. We only have 44 ground-based missile interceptors. Each one of these only has a 50% chance of intercepting a nuclear missile. So can this system work?
Yeah, here you go, Rick. Going to your point directly, because I've discussed this previously on the Ukraine show with Sasha. The Golden Dome system does in fact have an unspoken weakness, which people are tacitly acknowledging, because for the Golden Dome, unlike the Israel's Iron Dome, which is designed to block 90 to 95% of short range to intermediate range ballistic missiles, because that's where their threat comes from. The Golden Dome has a hole in the top of the dome, in effect, because they cannot block reliably, as you stated, intercontinental ballistic missiles, which is where the main threat comes from. In order for, and here's where it gets interesting, by declaring an intent to construct a Golden Dome defense, which would effectively neutralize the nuclear arsenals of Russia, China, and North Korea, which in turn would be a repudiation of the Biden's national security strategy, which was based upon having to wage war against 3 nuclear armed adversaries, and therefore we must expand our nuclear arsenals. My research and analysis over the past several decades has shown that would have no effect on the perceptions of Russia, China, and North Korea, because they see nuclear weapons as a symbol of great power status and a means of leverage. So the way that what President Trump is effectively doing is he wants to get rid of all nuclear weapons. He wants to protect America against nuclear attack. If you do that, then you cannot and should not build more nuclear weapons or try to spend money on more advanced nuclear weapons. You're contradicting your own proposed strategy. So, but in order to construct the Golden Dome, if you may have noted, they're talking about spending $900 million to study space-based interceptors, candidate space-based interceptors. There are only 2 ways, one of which is not acknowledged, only 2 ways that you can have space-based interceptors. One, which is what Elon Musk and others have been talking about, satellite-based, space-based interceptors, with lasers and other types of things, which were originally thought of under SDI, but which were not deemed technically feasible at the time. The problem with having satellites in low Earth orbit, and when you have Russian and Chinese counter space satellites up there at the same time. I participated in the 1997 Army After Next Winter War Game, which simulated a similar situation in the year 2020. And what you get when you have satellites versus satellites, you have a hair trigger unstable situation in low Earth orbit, pretty much like a Mexican standoff in low Earth orbit, in which the side that fires first has a decisive advantage. And this is the people that are advocating putting many satellites up there do not realize this, because they are not paying attention to the lessons of that war game back in 1997. You can still get the results of that in a RAND report that was published, but it is not acknowledged. The other way, which is that you seal or perfect the Golden Dome, is not publicly acknowledged or discussed, except where Sasha and I have discussed it on his program. You perfect the Golden Dome by upgrading the U.S. Space Force with a space fleet. Where do you get a manned space fleet? Which Space Force Guardians would be, where do you get the space fleet from? You buy it from SpaceX. Starships, Falcon Heavies, Falcon 9s, but specifically Starships, which would, I know it sounds fanciful, Rick, but just hear me out.
Okay.
These starships would be armed with lasers. The difference between having starships armed with lasers in low Earth orbit and having satellites in low Earth orbit is that it doesn't matter if you really make much difference if satellites fire on other satellites, because satellites don't have mothers. On the other hand, if you have starships armed with lasers in low Earth orbit positioned to destroy nuclear missiles in their boost phase, then that is a clear act of war and would be a much more powerful deterrent against a space attack by the Russians or Chinese. It is not discussed, but it should be, and it should be war gamed and studied.
I see two things. One is the U.S. and Russia each have about 1,700 nuclear warheads that are said to be battle ready. We don't really know. China has 600. So if somebody fires 120 missiles, you're not going to get all of them. Any one that gets through kills 250,000 people when it hits. Thing two is we're starting to introduce AI into our readiness. AI, I think, is inherently destabilizing because you're turning to black box systems to tell you whether we should fire or not.
And that, Rick, is precisely why I would advocate having your man-in-the-loop system with manned spacecraft in low Earth orbit, manning those systems rather than AI. AI can assist. AI is a wonderful servant, but it's a terrible master. So you don't want to risk that. One last thing before Jacoby leaps in is that once you introduce credible strategic ballistic missile defense into the equation, you introduce a much greater degree of uncertainty into the minds of a potential attacker, such as Russia or China. They do not know how many of their missiles will get through should they fire against the defense. They don't know which ones will get through. What they do know is if they themselves do not have a credible strategic defense against a nuclear counterattack, they will be crushed by a combined nuclear counterattack from the U.S. and NATO. So, Jacoby, you look so happy to be here. Go ahead and leap in.
Because this is a great script for a movie. It's a great script for a movie because a golden dome is an impossibility based on the science around it, the actual physics around it. If you're talking about putting a quote unquote space fleet or a manned individual up there, now how is that person going to eat on a regular basis? Because they cannot sit up there for that long period of a time, because now you're talking about throwing in a whole space station and so on and so forth. Then if you look into the amount of debris that's currently orbiting our Earth at this moment, you're not going to be able to handle that space debris that's going to hit that manned aircraft. Then you're talking about the physics behind shooting down different missiles that's going to drop on top of different areas on the U.S., which are going to also harm people. The idea, great for a movie, but truthfully, and let me finish because you're interrupting me right now. Truthfully speaking, we're talking about straight science here. It doesn't work. The science, the mechanics, everything about it is an impossibility at this moment and even for the next 10 years. We don't have the laser technology to do it. We don't have the ballistic missile capabilities to do it. We don't have the fuel technology to keep an individual up in lower orbit for that long period of time. We don't have the amount of equipment to take care of it. It'll cost well past $1 trillion to even think or consider. And we can't even build a wall on the southern border, yet we're thinking that we have the technologies to be able to handle manned aircrafts with lasers on them. It sounds like something that is a great script for a movie, because you can go ahead and create your suspension of disbelief in that film. But in a reality and speaking scientifically, science and physics and actual the equipment that we currently have and are able to produce within even the next 10 years? Impossible.
Jaravi, I would like to
Go
mention
ahead. Oh,
you shouldn't worry about financial part of it, because with the hundreds of billions of dollars Russian money sitting in the West, in Europe, most of it, but also in the United States, this money will pay for this project and this technology. So financially, you don't have to worry about that at all.
and moreover, go ahead. Yeah.
Well,
Let Rick back in. Yeah, he's
All right,
got
I recommend a book came out a couple of years ago called Nuclear War by Annie Jacobson. During COVID, she talked to dozens of people who have designed America's nuclear offense and defensive systems. And she was shocked they talked to her, but everybody was sitting at home during COVID and they got really chatty. And what you learn from reading this book is how threadbare our system is and how lucky we've been. And like one thing that's crazy about the whole system is that we've got a crazy guy running North Korea. In the event of a nuclear launch, it's really hard to tell for both sides whether it's Russia who's launched or North Korea who's launched. And if we launch to intercept, Russia can't tell whether we're firing on them or on North Korea. All you need is, in the book, it explains if North Korea just fires off 2 missiles, that's enough to trick both sides into firing on each other with, international, wipes out the whole northern hemisphere.
And remember, we did have a nuclear proliferations deal that was in place. Who tore that deal up? That was Donald Trump. So when we're talking about all these extra things, and this is why I asked that question in the chat, because Dave, I agree with you. Yes, Biden seemed weak on foreign policy, and there were a lot of foreign leaders that were not going to listen to him. Trump does as well, because the red line that was crossed when they dropped bombs on American, on the military, when he was in his first term, Trump came out and said, "Oh well, nothing really happened. The soldiers just had headaches." When Donald Trump came into office this time and said, "Oh, he could solve the Ukraine-Russia war with just a phone call," he sent out a tweet telling Putin to stop it. You know what happened when that happened? Putin dropped some more bombs. When when Vladimir Zelensky was in the Oval Office and they were supposed to be doing this deal and Russia was supposed to be doing the ceasefire, it was the biggest bombing day. Just yesterday, I think it was yesterday, correct me if I'm wrong, Sasha, it was the biggest drone bombing day. So this is why I asked, what has Trump shown that was strength? Everybody's crossed his line, but he's done nothing in return. He wants deals. I get that. But he was never a good businessman to start. He's already had multiple bankruptcies.
Well, first, clearly Trump has not been able to deliver on his promise that he would stop the war in the first day. And he's found this to be a lot more difficult than he thought. But we'll see what ends up happening from here going forward. But I think you also have to look at the facts. That during his first term and during his second term, Putin didn't invade anything. All right. The incursions occurred in 2014, in 2022. One of the things that people need to keep in mind is you cannot deter aggression after the fact. You must deter aggression before it occurs. Secondly, personally, from what I know, I think this Golden Dome thing makes no sense whatsoever. And from a personal standpoint, I would hope that we could ultimately move to the point where there is a dramatic reduction in the number of nuclear weapons in the world, because they're a very destabilizing force. It could be the end of civilization if we ever had to use them on a strategic basis. They're incredibly expensive to maintain. And for many, many different reasons, I think it makes no sense. I mean, we've got about 6,000. Russia has about 6,000. Way more than necessary, by far, way more than necessary.
When
And
you consider that during the height of the Cold War, they each had over 30,000.
yeah,
So,
right. But,
in one sense, it's progress, but still,
well, yeah,
yes.
but the point is way in excess of what you need to have a credible deterrent. Way in excess. I mean, I have a friend whose son mans one of the missile launching capabilities, right? I mean, as Jacoby said, I don't know what the exact number is. It's probably a classified number, so I wouldn't say it anyway. But a lot of the nuclear weapons that we have and that Russia has are not ready. We have them, but we can't use them right now. So whatever. So let me just stop at that.
So the cost of maintaining our nuclear arsenal is about $95 billion a year. I think both sides, like arms reduction has worked. We used each side in the 60s used to have 6,000, or at least claimed to have 6,000 battle-ready warheads. Now we're down to 1,700 battle-ready warheads apiece. If you could knock it down by like another 80%, it would save each side tens of billions of dollars a year and also reduce risk somewhat. Also, Putin is broke from his war. He'd love to save a ton of money, and the U.S.'s policy is trying to find places to cut. If we could do arms control, we could save a ton of money and reduce risk.
I vote yes.
And
No,
here's
like a
the
good
other,
yes.
here's the other thing. Former Russian President Boris Yeltsin kind of gave the game away back in 1994 in a speech to the Russian Duma when he stated that the only reason Russia is considered a great power is because its armed forces have nuclear weapons. That tells you pretty much what you need to know. As far as investing in additional nuclear weapons, we don't need to do that. I say we do not need to invest. We only need to maintain a certain portion of what we have, and any additional thing you invest in strategic defense against ballistic missiles, against the portion of the so-called Golden Dome. And given if you're going to invest in strategic defense against ballistic missiles, you don't concentrate on building a whole bunch of satellites, which, by the way, would increase, as Jacoby mentioned, the potential for space junk. By the way, that would be one of the ongoing missions, believe it or not, of a space fleet. They would be up there in orbit being resupplied by Elon Musk's supply ships, which he does have those in it ready to resupply the other spacecraft. But he would have also cleaning up space junk would be one of the ongoing missions of the U.S. Space Force's fleet. That and being prepared, if necessary, to take on the mission of blocking asteroids, meteors, or comets that might threaten to destroy or collide with Earth. That's a worthwhile investment for a space fleet. If you're going
Rick, the numbers are right, and you said that it cost us $90 billion a year to maintain our nuclear force, and let's assume that our nuclear force equals Russia's. Okay, then it would cost Russia $90 billion a year to maintain its nuclear force. How do they do that when their total budget is $66 billion?
The answer is they may not be able to. It may be a hollow force.
That's what I'm thinking. I'm not sure if their nuclear weapons are.
They drink a lot of vodka. They're using all these funds to buy vodka. That's all.
They're only
There's a good chance that their nuclear weapons are not being maintained.
They're only spending 10 billion. We spend 90+ billion. They only spend 10 billion.
Because it's now much cheaper in Russia.
No, they only spend 10 billion. I did have a quick question
in Trump's election campaign, Ukraine was not a big issue. All he said that he will settle this war in 24 hours, and that was end of story. It was issue probably by number 15 because economy, inflation, immigration, and so on. So Ukraine was maybe number 15, maybe even below. So now, when the economy is being destroyed, when inflation is getting out of hand, when United States Moody's was downgraded from AAA to AA1, So now all of a sudden Ukraine is now an issue. Ukraine, let's make a peace, let's trade with Russia, let's try this and that. And so. No more talks about inflation, no more talk about economy. So this is why we are all so preoccupied. Even if United States will step aside and European Union will continue supply Ukraine, they will destroy Russia in next few months. Just United States, just get out of all this negotiation garbage. Just get out, just say we are sick and tired. We have so many other things. You're going to Middle East, you're going to Qatar, United States, Arab Emirates, you sign contracts worth $55 trillion. Why do you need Ukraine and Russia? Why are you spending your priceless time on there? Just go away.
Because
David, I got a quick question for you.
Hold on. Because he said he would settle it, he's going to try.
24 hours done. Okay, I couldn't do it.
But Sasha, it's getting close to the point where he may quit trying. Okay, but the reason he's trying is because he said he would try. But we'll see. I'm sorry.
No, not because of that. I'm sorry, Dave. Not because of that, because of his Geschäft diplomacy. He wants to trade with Putin. He wants to do this projects like Arctic and so on. He doesn't care about peace at all. The way of the peace negotiations is to get close to Putin and to go with his Geschäft diplomacy. That's all what it is.
I got a question. I got a question for everybody, including you, David, and Sasha, as we're winding down and everything. Because you said it wasn't the number one concern, but if you talk to young people, and I have the pleasure because of where I work, talking to young people, and definitely I have 2 nephews of my own. Might not have any kids of my own, but if you talk to young people, their number one concern is that's why some of them are not having kids, as Rick is pointing out, and everything is the fact that we as a society are going to blow ourselves up and everything like that. And I know you've got grandkids, David, and everything. So how much do you think that is an issue that people are actually concerned about? Because I think it's one of the number one issues for our young people. That's what my philosophy is for when I'm talking to young people, particularly whether it's my nephews or some of the other young people, is that they are delaying gratification because of a fear of us destroying ourselves.
Yeah, they wonder if they're going to be alive when they're 30.
I've got kids and I've got grandkids, okay? And I do not think that they're concerned about us blowing each other up. They are, however, concerned about the future. And they don't like the path that we're on. And they're very uncertain about whether the future is going to be better than the past from many different dimensions, from an economic dimension, from an environmental dimension, from a security dimension. And I think that's, you used to be able to support a family with one earner. You can't do that anymore. It takes 2. And depending upon where you live, that may not even be enough to be able to do it with one job. So the circumstances are very different. Yeah.
I just want to say almost completely agree with you, Dave, because I don't think it's the blowing up or anything else. I think you are the man for this because it is about the economy. A lot of people aren't having, because the affordability. It costs $60,000, well, roughly between $40,000 to $60,000 just to have a child, and that's just to have the birth. And then on top of that, you're looking at all the necessities after that. Can you afford it? Is the first thing that pops in somebody's mind over, are we going to blow each other up or no? Because people always think that they can protect their child, and that's their first and foremost focus. But can they afford the child? It's so expensive now, and that's what's deterring a lot more people than anything.
Economics is number one, in my view. Okay. Current and future, because after all, it's not just the current cost. We're mortgaging the future of our country, our kids, our grandkids, and future generations. This bill that's considered by Congress right now is going to make things worse, not better. But Sasha, be careful about the economic statistics are better than you're asserting. Inflation is down from what it was in January of 2025 when Trump took office. Unemployment is not a problem. In fact, we have way more people. We have way more job openings than we have people looking for jobs, although we don't have the right match of what we need versus
Okay, what's the latest Trump approval rating? Do you know that?
I don't.
It's, it's
I
irrelevant.
do. I
Can we
do.
say-
You know,
Can we
I
say
don't-
that
Disapproval, 46% approval. He's hanging in there. It's slightly better than it was at the same point in his first administration.
And you got to
Can we
remember,
agree-
Trump
we-
supporters will crawl over broken glass to vote for Trump or
Yeah.
support him. So
Can we say that the economy is a mixed bag? Because as you talk about the inflation number sitting at 4.2, which is, yes, sitting right where he had it at 2025 or when he took over office. But the stock
0.4.
market is
2.4, not 4.2.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. But yeah, it's sitting roughly about where he took over. However, the stock market is lower than when he took over. The dollar value is lower. I mean, it's just a mixed bag. I agree on both ends that yes, there are the inflationary numbers and the unemployment numbers. However, like with Sasha, I kind of lean towards that it's not that great because remember, if we're going to hold him accountable, then we need to hold him accountable because prices are still pretty high. We have Walmart that just said that they're going to announce higher price. They announced they're going to raise their prices, and there are other companies that are going to follow suit. So if we can hold him accountable, that's why I lean towards agreeing with Sasha on the economy looking bad, even though it is a mixed bag.
Wait a sec. Economic numbers that are being published lately, they do not include yet the tariffs. The next month's report, they will include tariffs, and you will see what the number is.
Well, as they say, it's not over till it's over, but our show
I
is
think
over.
it's over.
So the thing is, we'd like to thank the Honorable David Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, our panelists from around the world, and we'll see you next week on Economics with the Honorable David Walker. Stay out of nuclear war. Until then, take care. Bye.
Thank you.